The year was 1948, a presidential election year it was. Harry Truman ran for the National Democrats against the Republican challenger, Thomas Dewey. And against the States' Rights Party, which was a Southern offshoot of the Democratic Party led by Strom Thurmond. The election of 1948 was one of the closest in American history. Most political people predicted that Truman would lose. They believed that it was impossible for a Democratic to win the White House without the votes of Southerns. The Southern States Rights Democrats, better known as Dixiecrats, had no real chance of winning either, but it was assumed that they would drain off enough votes that the Republican Dewey would win. To everyone's surprise, including Truman himself, he won the election. Truman would serve altogether for more than 7.5 years, from 1945 to 1953. Truman's second term in office was even more excellent than the first. As president, Truman developed the reputation as a no-nonsense kind of guy. He was the man who first made the famous adage, "The buck stops here." He also earned the nickname, "Give 'em hell, Harry," for being such a straight talker. He did not mince words. He said what was on his mind, always, and that made him beloved by so many Americans. Most importantly, it made him tactless in affairs. Many Americans thought of him as a caretaker in the White House and not a real leader. For example, while he was dealing with his allies, particularly Joseph Stalin, in the last year of the war, Truman rubbed them the wrong way. It was Truman's manner that partly made Stalin so distrustful and fearful of the Americans after World War II. Truman made several decisions as president. The first decision was the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. The next decision was not to share the technology with the Soviets about how to build the atomic bomb, even though we already shared the technology with our other ally, England. Some political leaders at the time believed this was the wrong decision. If the USA had been a little bit friendlier to the Russians after World War II, perhaps there had never been a Cold War, but we will never know. Another very important decision that Truman made was to desegregate the armed forces of the United States. Truman, in fact, took a more proactive stand on African American civil rights issues than any president before him. He ordered a few federal government studies to be done to determine what the main problems were facing Black Americans in the late 1940s and offer solutions. The result of the study was the publication of a document called "To Secure These Rights." The document said that the federal government must take the responsibility for correcting the problems of racial discrimination because neither the white American public nor the state governments would take it. The most important issue was the Korean War, which began in 1950 and lasted the end of his term in 1953. The Korean War was a product of the Cold War. It resulted from a difference. The difference included the communists and the democratic capitalists, both of whom wanted to own and control Korea. This so-called war was not a declared war and not an official war. However, more than 50,000 Americans died fighting in this undeclared, unofficial war. Korea. Korea is a peninsula that sticks out from the northern part of China, right beside Japan. Korea is about the size of Japan, the Philippines, or Florida. Historically, Korea had always been a territory that other nations fought. During World War II, Japan had taken control of it. At the end of the world, when the USA was engaged in its island-hopping strategy to liberate captive lands from the Japanese, we arrived in Korea from the south side at the same exact time as the Russians arrived from the north. The same thing happened to Korea in 1945, as it happened to Germany in 1945 as well. USA and the USSR divided it right down the middle at the 38th parallel. The Soviets took the north half of Korea and set up a communist puppet government there, while the Americans took the south half and set up a democratic capitalist government there. The two lived side by side in an uneasy peace for about 5 years. In 1950, the North Korean communists launched an unprovoked attack on the south in an attempt to take possession of the whole peninsula. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been presiding over Japan for the previous 5 years, immediately jumped over to Korea to take charge of defending the Southern Korean government from the communist menace. He called President Truman and asked for reinforcements, which Truman immediately sent. Around 5.7 million Americans would serve in Korea. Despite the effort, the North Koreans had too much momentum initially and easily pushed the American and the UN forces back. The Americans were backed into a corner, the southeastern corner of the peninsula, where MacArthur set up a defense perimeter called the Pusan Perimeter to make a final stand. With his back to the ocean, MacArthur decided to make a bold counter-offensive move. He left most of his force defending the Pusan Perimeter and withdrew the rest by sea to perform a surprise flanking maneuver. He brought this force down by ship and around the other side of the peninsula and landed it at the Incheon Landing. The Incheon Landing caught the North Koreans completely off guard. MacArthur had the enemies sandwiched in between two American forces, resulting in the capture of more than 100,000 North Koreans. At that point, MacArthur then began driving his army north and driving back the enemy. MacArthur did not stop at the 38th parallel either. He took the battle far over that line, actually pushing the enemy all the way to the northern border of North Korea at the Yalu River. On the other side of the river was China, which had just become a communist nation in 1945 and was therefore an ally of North Korea. MacArthur wanted to take his army across the river into China. President Truman told him, "Do not do that." Truman did not want to start a war with China. He did not want to wake the sleeping giant. MacArthur thought such a policy was absurd. The U.S. had nuclear weapons. If the Chinese joined the war, the USA should nuke them. Truman said, "Nonsense." MacArthur openly criticized his commander-in-chief, Truman, for the decision, which created a lot of tension in the chain of command. Truman responded by relieving MacArthur of his command. He replaced him with General Matthew Ridgway, who did only what Truman told him to do. What Truman told him to do was hold the line at the 38th parallel, not to cross it, not to drive the enemy back, but just to contain the enemy. This was the containment policy in action. Upon MacArthur's dismissal, the old soldier retired from the U.S. Army and came back to the United States. Instead of the Republican Party choosing MacArthur to run for president, it chose another World War II hero, Dwight Eisenhower. MacArthur faded into obscurity, a bitter old man. It would be up to Eisenhower, therefore, to end the war in Korea.